James sat at the kitchen table, watching Marcus push his cereal around with a spoon. His son was usually full of energy in the mornings, excited about getting to school early to chat with friends or catch up on homework. But lately, James had noticed a change. Marcus seemed withdrawn, his eyes often cast down, his responses clipped. Today, the boy's shoulders were hunched, his mouth set in a tight line. James decided to ask gently, "You feeling okay, buddy?" He kept his voice light, trying not to sound too concerned. Marcus glanced up, then quickly looked away. "Yeah, just tired," he muttered, his hand instinctively reaching up to his arm, adjusting the sleeve of his shirt. James noticed the gesture and frowned. "What happened there?" he asked, pointing to the faint bruise just visible under the cuff. Marcus pulled his sleeve down quickly, a defensive move that made James's heart clench. "It's nothing," Marcus mumbled, shifting in his chair. But James wasn't buying it. "Marcus, look at me," he urged. "You know you can tell me anything, right?" Marcus hesitated, then finally looked up, eyes filled with a mix of fear and frustration. "It's just, there's this kid at school," he started, his voice low. "Tommy. He's been saying things, doing things." James's jaw tightened. "What kind of things?" he pressed, keeping his voice steady. "Calling me names," Marcus admitted reluctantly. "You know, racist stuff. And he shoved me into a locker yesterday. That's how I got this." He gestured to the bruise. James felt a surge of anger, his hands clenching into fists under the table. But he knew he had to stay calm, for Marcus's sake. "Why didn't you tell me earlier?" he asked, trying to keep the anger out of his voice. Marcus shrugged, looking embarrassed. "I didn't want to make things worse. I thought maybe it would stop." James reached across the table, placing a hand on his son's. "I'm sorry this is happening, son," he said quietly. "But we need to do something about it. You shouldn't have to deal with this alone." Marcus looked uncertain, fear flickering in his eyes. "But if I say something, it'll just get worse," he whispered. "He'll tell his friends, and they'll all come after me." James nodded, understanding the fear but unwilling to let it paralyze them. "I get that," he said softly. "But doing nothing isn't the answer either. We have to stand up to this." He could see Marcus wrestling with the idea, torn between fear and the desire for it all to just end. What if you went to the school?" Marcus finally suggested. "Talk to someone. Maybe they could help." James nodded slowly, already forming a plan in his mind. "That's exactly what I'm going to do," he agreed. "I'm going to speak with the principal today. This has to stop." Marcus nodded, though he still seemed apprehensive. "Just don't make it a big deal, okay?" he pleaded. James gave a small, reassuring smile. "I promise," he said. "I'll do everything I can to keep it calm. But I won't let them ignore this, Marcus. You deserve to feel safe at school." The words hung in the air between them, a promise James was determined to keep. He was aware, though, of the challenges ahead. It wasn't just about talking to the school. It was about navigating a situation loaded with complexities he'd faced all his life. The racial dynamics were always there, like an undercurrent, ready to pull him under if he wasn't careful. But this wasn't about him, it was about Marcus. And he'd be damned if he let his son grow up feeling powerless. James felt a familiar mix of frustration and determination as he grabbed his keys and headed out the door. He dealt with situations like this before, subtle, quiet racism that slipped under the radar, dismissed by those who didn't have to live with it every day. He knew he had to tread carefully, but he also knew that staying silent wasn't an option. As he drove to the school, he played through different scenarios in his mind, thinking about how to approach the conversation. He wanted to be calm, rational, but firm. He wanted to make it clear that this wasn't just about kids being kids or boys being boys. This was about his son's right to feel safe and respected. And he wasn't going to back down. Arriving at the school, James took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever was to come. He was ready to fight for Marcus, To do whatever it took to ensure his son wouldn't have to face this alone, James walked through the school's front entrance with purpose, making his way to the administration office. He knew he had to keep his emotions in check, but his heart pounded with a mix of anger and anxiety. When he finally sat down across from Ms. Lawrence, the principal, he tried to stay calm, starting with a direct approach. He explained the situation clearly, describing the bullying and the specific racial slurs Marcus had been subjected to. Ms. Lawrence listened, nodding politely, but her expression was neutral, almost bored. When James finished speaking, she gave a faint smile, as if she had heard this all before. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Johnson," she began, her tone overly patient. "But boys will be boys. They roughhouse, they tease, sometimes they just don't know the impact of their words." James felt a flash of frustration. "This isn't just teasing," he countered, his voice firm. "This is targeted harassment. My son is scared to come to school. He has a bruise from being shoved into a locker, and he's been called names no child should ever hear." Ms. Lawrence raised her hand slightly, as if to calm him down. "I hear you, Mr. Johnson," she said, still in that same placating tone. "But these are young kids. They don't always understand the consequences of what they're saying. We have to give them a chance to learn and grow." James leaned forward, not willing to let her brush this aside. "And what about my son's chance?" he pressed. "Marcus has a right to feel safe and respected here. You have an obligation to make sure that happens. Ignoring this is not an option." Ms. Lawrence sighed, tapping a pencil on her desk, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. "We'll talk to Tommy," she said vaguely. "Maybe a warning will do the trick. But you need to understand, these things can't always be resolved overnight." James's patience was wearing thin. "A warning?" he repeated incredulously. "That's all? A slap on the wrist while my son is made to feel less than human? This is not just some playground spat, this is racism." Before Ms. Lawrence could respond, the office door swung open, and a man in his late 40s stepped in, his face tight with annoyance. Mr. Dawson, Tommy's father, had arrived, called in by the school, and he didn't look pleased. He glanced at James with a dismissive smirk and turned to Ms. Lawrence. "I hear there's been some misunderstanding," he started, his voice dripping with sarcasm. James turned to face him, keeping his voice steady. "There's no misunderstanding here. Your son has been bullying mine, using racial slurs, and physically attacking him. This needs to stop." Mr. Dawson chuckled, a mocking sound. "Kids will be kids," he said lightly. "Boys fight. They rough each other up. Doesn't mean it's some big racist conspiracy." He glanced at Ms. Lawrence, who seemed relieved at the interruption, almost as if he had taken her side by default. James felt his anger flare but kept it under control. "It's not just a fight," he said coldly. "Your son has been targeting Marcus because of his race. That's not just boys being boys. That's learned behavior, and it's unacceptable." Mr. Dawson's expression hardened. "Maybe your son is overreacting," he suggested, his tone shifting to something more cutting. "Or maybe he's just misunderstanding things. My Tommy's a good kid. He doesn't have a mean bone in his body." James felt the room grow tense, the air heavy with the unspoken. He knew this was no longer just about Marcus and Tommy. This was about how their fathers viewed the world. "This isn't a misunderstanding," James repeated firmly. "Your son needs to be held accountable. This isn't going away." Mr. Dawson crossed his arms, leaning back slightly, his smile tight. "And what do you suggest, Mr. Johnson? That we punish him for something he probably didn't even do? You think your kid's the only one with feelings?" James met his gaze steadily. "No," he replied. "I think all kids have feelings. But your son needs to learn that his actions have consequences. If he doesn't, this will just keep happening." Ms. Lawrence cleared her throat, trying to regain control of the meeting. "Gentlemen," she interjected, "let's not let this get out of hand. We're here to find a solution, not to accuse each other." James felt his frustration rising again. "A solution?" he asked. The solution is clear. Take this seriously. Teach these kids that racism is not okay, in any form. That's your job as educators. Mr. Dawson scoffed. Educators, huh? Maybe you should teach your own son to toughen up. Not everything is about race, you know. Some kids are just different. James's hands clenched into fists under the table, his voice tight with controlled anger. And by different you mean black, right? Because that's what this is really about. And I won't let you or anyone else diminish what my son is going through. Mr. Dawson rolled his eyes, clearly uninterested in any deeper discussion. You're making a mountain out of a molehill, he muttered. Boys fight. They get over it. No need to drag this out. James felt his patience snap. I'm not dragging anything out, he said, his voice low but firm. I'm standing up for my son. And I won't back down until something changes. The room fell silent for a moment, tension crackling in the air. James knew this was far from over, but he also knew he couldn't let this moment pass without making it clear that he wouldn't be ignored. He would fight for Marcus, no matter what it took. James took a deep breath, keeping his voice steady. Mr. Dawson, I'm not here to argue, he began. I'm here to protect my son. What Tommy did to Marcus is not just roughhousing or boys being boys. The words he used, the way he pushed him into that locker, those are actions meant to demean and intimidate. It's not just a joke. It's harmful. And it needs to stop. Mr. Dawson crossed his arms, his expression hardening. You're acting like Tommy is some kind of monster, he retorted, his voice edged with irritation. Kids mess around, they test each other's limits. Doesn't mean they have some agenda or that it's all about race. Maybe your son just needs to learn how to stand up for himself instead of running to daddy every time something happens. James felt a flicker of anger but forced himself to stay composed. Teaching a child to stand up for themselves is one thing, he replied, but allowing them to be bullied and racially targeted is another. This isn't about Marcus not being tough enough. It's about Tommy crossing a line that shouldn't be crossed by any kid, regardless of who they are. Mr. Dawson leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. And what are you teaching your son, huh? To play the victim card whenever things don't go his way? To see every little thing as an insult? Maybe that's the real problem here. James's expression didn't change, but his mind flashed back to his own childhood. He remembered the names he was called on the playground, the way teachers would look the other way, pretending not to hear. He remembered his father's tired face, coming home from work, telling him that he had to be twice as good, twice as strong, just to be seen as equal. Those memories, buried deep but never forgotten, fueled his determination now. He looked directly at Mr. Dawson. I'm teaching my son to know his worth, James said, his voice calm but firm. I'm teaching him that he deserves to be treated with respect, no matter who he is or where he comes from. And I'm teaching him that it's okay to speak up when something is wrong, even when people don't want to listen. Mr. Dawson let out a derisive laugh. Respect? He scoffed. Respect is earned, not demanded. Maybe if you taught your kid to respect authority instead of challenging it every chance he gets, we wouldn't be here right now. James's eyes flashed with frustration, but he kept his tone measured. I respect authority, he replied. But I don't respect authority that looks the other way when a child is hurting. And I certainly don't respect adults who teach their kids that it's okay to belittle others because of the color of their skin. Mr. Dawson's face reddened. Oh, please, he sneered. You think you're so righteous, coming in here with all your demands. You want an apology? Fine. But you should be teaching your kid to be tougher, not to cry about every little thing. Life's hard. You think my son doesn't get picked on? But I don't come running to the school every time he scrapes his knee. James felt the heat rising in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. An apology isn't just about words, he said. It's about acknowledging that what happened was wrong and committing to change. That's what I'm asking for. Not just for Marcus, but for all the kids in this school who might be facing the same thing. Mr. Dawson leaned back, a sarcastic smile on his lips. You really think you're going to change the world with an apology? He mocked. Good luck with that. Boys need to toughen up, not be coddled. James clenched his jaw, feeling the tension escalate. Toughness isn't about enduring abuse, he shot back. It's about standing up for what's right. And right now, what's right is for Tommy to acknowledge what he did and for the school to take this seriously. Mr. Dawson's face twisted with disdain. You're raising a weak kid, he spat. Someone who's going to go through life thinking the world owes him something. Let me tell you, the world doesn't owe him a damn thing. James's hands balled into fists at his sides. And what are you raising, Mr. Dawson? He replied, his voice low and steady. Someone who thinks it's okay to bully others? Someone who thinks they're better than anyone else because of the color of their skin. Mr. Dawson's eyes narrowed. Watch yourself, he warned, his tone suddenly more threatening. You're walking a fine line, Mr. Johnson. James felt a surge of frustration, but he refused to back down. I'm done walking lines, he said firmly. I'm done with people like you teaching kids like Tommy that it's okay to hurt others without consequence. This stops now. Mr. Dawson's face grew redder, his fists clenching on the table. You calling my son a liar? He challenged, his voice rising. James didn't flinch. If your son says he didn't do it, then yes, he replied calmly. Because my son has no reason to lie about something like this. And if you think he does, then maybe you need to ask yourself why. Mr. Dawson's hand slammed down on the table, his face twisted with anger. How dare you? He shouted. My boy doesn't lie. He doesn't need to, unlike some people. James's voice remained steady, but his eyes were sharp. I'm not here to argue with you, Mr. Dawson. I'm here to demand justice for my son. And I won't leave until I get it. The room seemed to shrink around them, the tension almost tangible. Mr. Dawson's face was flushed, his breath heavy, while James stood firm, refusing to be intimidated. He knew he had crossed a line, but it was a line that needed crossing. He wasn't here to make friends or avoid conflict. He was here to stand up for his son, and he wasn't backing down. Ms. Lawrence finally raised her hands to calm the room. We need to find a resolution, she insisted, trying to regain control. Perhaps a temporary suspension for Tommy might be the best course of action for now, just to allow things to cool down. Mr. Dawson shot up from his chair, his face flushed with anger. A suspension? Over a few words and a shove? He shook his head furiously, turning toward James. You've made this into a circus, he snarled. I'm not letting my son be punished for this nonsense. I'll handle it my way. Without waiting for another word, Mr. Dawson stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind him. The tension hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. James stared at the closed door for a moment, then turned back to Ms. Lawrence, who seemed visibly relieved that one source of conflict had left the room. I hope you understand the seriousness of this, he said firmly before leaving himself. At home that evening, Marcus was restless. He paced around the living room, his face flushed with frustration and fear. Dad, this is embarrassing, he muttered. Everyone's going to think I'm weak now. I shouldn't have told you anything. James sat down, trying to find the right words. You did the right thing, Marcus, he reassured him. You stood up for yourself by speaking out. But I understand it's not easy. It never is. That's why we have to face it together. Marcus shook his head. I don't want everyone talking about me. I just want it to stop, he replied, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. James could see the conflict in his son's eyes, the shame, the doubt. He knew this was a critical moment. Then we'll find another way, he said quietly. We'll work on this together. You're stronger than you know, Marcus, and we're not going to let anyone make you feel otherwise. But as the evening dragged on, James couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. He thought about Mr. Dawson's reaction, the anger that seemed almost too intense for what had happened. Something about it felt off, too personal. He decided he had to take a more proactive approach, not just for Marcus's sake but for his own peace of mind. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. When he opened it, he was surprised to find Mr. Dawson standing there, his expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" Mr. Dawson asked, his voice unusually calm. James hesitated but then nodded, stepping out onto the porch. Mr. Dawson's demeanor was different, still tense but somehow quieter, almost contrite. "Look, I'm not here to fight," he started, glancing around as if unsure of his own words. "I'm here because I wanted to apologize for earlier." James crossed his arms, skeptical. "Apologize?" he echoed. "That's a first." Mr. Dawson nodded slowly. "Yeah, I know I came off strong. But you gotta understand. I've been where your boy is. I've been on the receiving end too, but not in the way you think." James frowned, unsure of where this was going. "What do you mean?" he asked cautiously. Mr. Dawson sighed, leaning against the porch railing. "I grew up poor," he said quietly. "Real poor. We didn't have much, and I got picked on for it. Called names, pushed around. I hated it. I hated how it made me feel, how powerless it was. And I guess, somewhere along the way, I decided I'd never be that weak again." James stayed silent, listening. "So when I see Tommy acting up, yeah, it gets to me," Mr. Dawson continued, his voice rough. "I don't want him to be soft. I don't want him to go through what I went through. I want him to be tough, to stand up for himself, to never back down." James's expression softened slightly. "That's understandable," he replied. "But there's a difference between being tough and being cruel. Tommy isn't just standing up for himself, he's tearing others down to make himself feel bigger. That's not strength, that's insecurity." Mr. Dawson's face tightened for a moment, then he looked away, his voice dropping. "You think I don't know that?" he muttered. "But it's hard, you know? Hard to teach him differently when I'm still fighting my own demons." James nodded, seeing a side of Mr. Dawson he hadn't expected. "We all have our struggles," he said slowly. "But we can't let them define how we treat others. I'm not asking you to make your son weak. I'm asking you to make him better. Teach him respect, empathy. That's real strength." Mr. Dawson shifted uncomfortably. "Maybe you're right," he admitted, almost begrudgingly. "But you know, it's not that simple. Old habits die hard. And Tommy, he looks up to me. He's just doing what he thinks I'd want him to do." James nodded again, a sense of understanding settling in. "And that's why it starts with us," he replied. "As fathers, as men. We set the example. We can show them that there's a better way." Mr. Dawson looked at him for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. "Maybe," he muttered, almost to himself. "Maybe there is." Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his car, leaving James standing on the porch, contemplating the unexpected turn of events. As he watched Mr. Dawson drive away, James felt a mix of emotions: frustration, hope, uncertainty. But one thing was clear: this wasn't just a battle between their sons, it was a battle between their worlds, their experiences, their choices. And maybe, just maybe, there was still a way to find common ground. James watched Mr. Dawson as he stood there, a hint of uncertainty in his posture that hadn't been there before. For a moment, James saw past the bravado and anger, sensing something deeper, something raw. He realized that beneath Mr. Dawson's aggression, there was fear of being vulnerable, of being seen as weak, of failing his son in the same way he felt failed by life. James took a breath and decided to break the silence. "You know," he began slowly, "I think we both want the same thing. We both want our kids to grow up strong, to face the world without fear. But strength doesn't come from hate or anger. It comes from understanding, from knowing who you are and being proud of it." Mr. Dawson looked down, his shoulders slumping slightly. "It's not that easy," he muttered, almost to himself. "You grow up hearing certain things, believing certain things, and then you pass it down without even realizing it. I don't want Tommy to grow up like that, but I don't know how to change it. James felt a small shift, a crack in the armor. We're all products of our upbringing, he acknowledged. But that doesn't mean we can't choose differently for our kids. I don't want Marcus to grow up thinking he's less than anyone else, and I'm sure you don't want Tommy growing up with hate in his heart. Mr. Dawson hesitated, then nodded slowly. You're right, he admitted, his voice quieter now. I don't want him to be filled with that poison. But it's hard, you know? The world's tough. People expect you to be tough back. James nodded in agreement. True, but being tough doesn't mean being cruel. It means being strong enough to know what's right and stand by it, even when it's hard. That's what real strength is. And maybe that's the lesson we both need to teach our sons. Mr. Dawson glanced at him, his expression softened by a hint of understanding. Maybe, he conceded. But I don't know where to start. I've been raising him to be hard, to never back down, and now I'm not sure if I'm doing it right. James felt a moment of connection, a realization that they were both navigating unfamiliar territory. It's not easy, he agreed. But we can start by showing them what respect looks like. By setting an example. By working together instead of against each other. Mr. Dawson considered this, a conflicted look in his eyes. Work together? He echoed. What does that even look like? James smiled slightly. It looks like us having this conversation, he said. It looks like us deciding that our kids are going to be better than we were. That they're going to know empathy and respect because we taught them that. We can't change the past, but we can shape the future. Mr. Dawson was quiet for a moment, then he let out a slow breath. I'm not used to this, he admitted. Not used to letting my guard down. But I guess maybe it's time to try something different. James extended his hand, offering a tentative truce. Let's start small, he suggested. Maybe we can organize a few things together, community events, talks about respect and understanding. Let the kids see us working together, not just fighting. Mr. Dawson hesitated, then slowly reached out and shook James's hand. All right, he said gruffly. But don't expect miracles. I'm not sure how much Tommy will listen. James nodded. We don't need miracles, he replied. Just a step in the right direction. It's a start. The two men released their grip, and for the first time, there was no tension between them. Just a shared understanding that they were both trying to do their best, however imperfectly. Later, Marcus and Tommy found themselves face to face in the schoolyard, each unsure of what to say. They stood there awkwardly for a moment, either wanting to be the first to speak. Finally, Tommy muttered, I'm sorry. For the things I said. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Yeah, okay, he replied. I guess it's just hard, you know. Tommy nodded, glancing down. Yeah, my dad says we have to figure this out. Together. Marcus gave a small smile. Maybe we can. I mean, we don't have to like each other right away, but maybe we can start with not hating each other. Tommy looked up and gave a hesitant nod. Yeah, maybe, he agreed. As they stood there, not quite friends but no longer enemies, a quiet understanding began to form, the first step towards something better. A voiceover speaks, reflecting on the moment. Standing up for what's right isn't always easy. It often means stepping out of our comfort zones, challenging the beliefs we've held, and finding the courage to see others in a different light. It means breaking the cycles of prejudice and choosing dialogue over conflict, empathy over hate. And in these small steps, we find the strength to create a world where every child, every person, can stand tall and be proud of who they are.